Hello, parents and guardians, and welcome back to another discipleship debrief. Actually, the final discipleship debrief of the school year. It's very exciting. Last night, CBC Youth wrapped up our series in the book of Mark. It was very exciting. We finished chapter 16. We read verses 1 to 8. If you don't know, the verses 9 to 20 are not included in the earliest manuscripts and thematically don't fit and even linguistically don't fit. So it seems pretty likely that they are not actually part of Mark's original writing. So we left those aside, and ending at verse 8, we really do have this through line of the themes of Mark. And the themes of Mark really, we haven't brought it up too many times, but the themes of Mark really is fearful, struggling, doubting people, and then Christ victorious, right? So you have these two things kind of at odds with each other. The Gospel of Mark focuses a lot on the doubt of the disciples, the fear of the disciples, the hardness of heart of the disciples, or even just of people following him. It focuses on the scandal of the gospel, the difficulty of understanding the gospel, all these things, right? But then at the same time, it has the fact that Christ's victory is unchanged, unhindered by humans, by our failings, by our shortcomings, by our fears, by our doubts. Christ's victory is unhindered by that, right? So we don't have to be victorious ourselves because we attach ourselves to his victory. And he is victorious despite all the shortcomings we bring. That's kind of the through line. You see it constantly. And in verses 1 to 8, chapter 16, you see it even in the resurrection narrative. We think of the resurrection narrative as the most joyful part of the Gospels, and it usually is, but in Mark's account, it's quite somber. It ends on the note of the female followers of Christ being given the charge, right? Jesus has been raised from the dead. Go tell the other disciples. And in verse 8, they flee, they run. And Mark even notes they tell no one. And we know from the other gospel accounts that they eventually do tell the other disciples. But in that moment, as Mark records, the female followers of Christ, they run, they flee, they are scared. And so we have yet again this recurrence of the theme of human fear and failure and doubt against the backdrop of Christ's victory. And so we talked about that. We broke this up really into those two themes, right? Fearful people and Christ's victory. The fact that Jesus is the Messiah despite us, right? And so we talked about the fear that these women had, and how it really ought to be relatable for us, right? We ought to never feel alone in our fear. We can look to the characters of the Bible and see that God's people have always been afraid. You can track it throughout the whole history of Israel, the church, everything. God's people have been fearful. We talked about how Mark's original audience would have been terrified reading this gospel, right? They were early Roman believers who were persecuted constantly. Their church services had to be in the sewers. And so they would have understood the fear and trepidation that comes with that. And what's also really interesting about Mark leaving us on verse 8 is it's almost like he's leaving us with the question of how will we respond, right? We have the truth presented. Jesus is the suffering servant, the Messiah. He died for his people and he rose to show that he was a sufficient sacrifice. The truth is presented. And you have verse 8, where his followers flee. And if that's the ending point, it almost feels like Mark is leaving the door open to say, well, how are you going to respond? You've just read the same thing that made them flee. How are you going to respond? Right? It brings to mind John chapter 6, where you have the multitude abandoning Christ, and he turns to the 12 and he says, are you going to leave as well? Right? And obviously there, Peter says, where else would we go? To whom else would we follow? But we're left with the same question. We see Jesus's followers run away and flee and be fearful, and we have to ask ourselves, are we going to do the same? We've just heard the same message they have. And really, what's so beautiful about this thematic through line of Mark is it reminds us time and time again that it is not about us. It is not about us. Because in the backdrop of their fear and their trepidation and their failure and them fleeing, we have verses 5 and 6, which contain the resurrection. the resurrection message. You came here looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He is not here. See where they laid him. He is not here. And so in the midst of all the fear of God's people, you still have God's victory. God's victory. The gospel was fulfilled without any help from Jesus' disciples because they were afraid. And it reminds us it's not about us. It's about Christ. Our entire lives, our entire livelihood following Christ, it's not about us. It's never been about us. It's about Christ. God's people are fearful and weak, and God is glorified because he does mighty things in spite of that. And so we return to where we started with Mark 1:1, where Mark simply says this is the start of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. What Mark has been doing this whole time is presenting this simple truth of the gospel. Jesus is the Son of God. He's the Messiah. He came to suffer and die for his people, to be raised on the third day, a sufficient sacrifice. He's been proclaiming this truth the whole time, and we get to see other people react to it. And then the question comes down as we wrap it up, right? And it leaves it hanging on verse 8. How are you going to respond? How are we going to respond in light of that? In light of this scandalous, dangerous truth, how are we going to respond? And that's where we get to leave it off with the students going into the summer to take time to reflect and to think about that exact question. How are you going to respond? And for you, as the main discipler in your home this week, to follow up with them, reread Mark 16, 1-8, and ask them, how are you going to respond? Follow up on that. Ask them, are you going to run away? Are you going to give in to the fear? Or are you going to trust God? Are you going to trust the fact that he's victorious despite all the fear you're feeling, despite the desire to run away, despite everyone else's reactions in the whole world? God is victorious. That is how we wrapped up the book of Mark. I'm very excited for the next school year, and keep an eye out. We've got events over the summer and stuff, but this will be our last normal youth group for a few months. So please take this, follow up with your student. If you have any questions or anything, reach out to me. Otherwise, see you in the fall.